What happens when silence itself becomes a weapon? That was the question in the dark waters of the Solomon Islands in late 1942. The moon hid behind thick clouds, leaving the sea black as ink. Out there, Japanese supply barges crept slowly forward, their engines whispering, carrying food, ammunition, and men desperately needed on Guadalcanal. To the crews, it felt like a normal run. The night was their shield, or so they thought. Unseen in the shadows, the hunters were already waiting. Small, fragile-looking boats, no bigger than fishing vessels, lay still on the black water. Their crews whispered quietly, every sound magnified in the silence. These were America's PT boats, patrol torpedo boats, tiny predators armed with torpedoes powerful enough to cripple a destroyer. And tonight, they were hungry. The first sign the Japanese had that death was near came as sudden flashes on the horizon. Tracer fire cut through the dark, followed by the roar of engines that until then had been silent. Torpedoes launched, slicing through the waves, invisible and deadly. Seconds later, explosions tore open the sea, sending walls of water and flame into the sky. Panic rippled across the Japanese convoy. Crews shouted. Guns opened fire wildly into the night, but the enemy was impossible to pin down. The PT boats darted in and out like ghosts, their wooden hulls skimming across the surface, their engines screaming as they struck again and again. Imagine being a Japanese sailor that night. One moment, calm water and routine. The next, chaos and terror. Your comrades vanish in fire. Your ship shudders under impact, and every shadow hides another attacker. Some called them phantoms on the water, enemies too small to see until it was too late. This was the new war in the Solomons. Not massive battleships trading broadsides under the sun, but fast, violent, and terrifying duels in total darkness. A war where small wooden boats could decide the fate of islands. A war that left Japanese officers asking a question they never thought they would. How could such tiny craft strike such a heavy blow? But to understand how this came to be, we must step back. These battles were not random. They were born out of desperation, strategy, and the brutal reality of a campaign that would decide control of the South Pacific. The Solomon Islands chain was more than scattered dots of jungle and coral. In 1942, it was the crossroads of the Pacific. Whoever held these islands could control supply routes, protect vital bases, and project power across thousands of miles of ocean. When Japan surged through Asia and the Pacific after Pearl Harbor, it captured the Solomons and built airfields on Guadalcanal. Those airfields threatened Allied lifelines to Australia and beyond. For America, losing them was not an option, and so began one of the most bitter campaigns of the war. Guadalcanal became a name written in blood. American Marines seized the airfield in August 1942, and ever since, Japan tried everything to take it back. But resupplying their stranded troops proved nearly impossible. The seas around the Solomons were crawling with danger. American planes bombed by day, Allied warships prowled by night, and submarines lurked below. Still, Japan could not abandon its men, and so the infamous Tokyo Express was born. Night after night, Japanese destroyers and barges dashed through narrow channels, bringing soldiers and supplies under cover of darkness. To the Japanese, it was a lifeline. To the Americans, it was a target. The US Navy, still recovering from Pearl Harbor, could not risk sending battleships on endless night chases. Instead, it turned to something unexpected, its smallest war machines. The PT boats, fast, cheap, disposable. At least that's how some officers saw them, but the Solomons would prove otherwise. Here, the PT boats were not just a supporting role. They became hunters, striking at the very arteries of the Japanese war effort. Their job was simple in words, deadly in practice. Wait in the dark, ambush the Tokyo Express, and vanish before the enemy could strike back. The stakes were enormous. If Japanese troops on Guadalcanal were kept hungry and undersupplied, the US Marines could hold the island. If not, the Allies might lose their foothold in the Pacific. In those black waters, in those tense midnight ambushes, the future of the entire campaign balanced on a knife's edge. And so, night after night, the PT boats went out. Crews of barely a dozen men each, many of them barely out of high school, faced destroyers hundreds of feet long bristling with guns. It was David versus Goliath on a dark ocean stage. Every mission carried the same risks: discovery, annihilation, or glory. What made these battles so terrifying for the Japanese was not just the damage done, but the shock itself. No empire, no navy, No admiral expected to lose face against such small opponents. Yet in the Solomons, those fragile boats were rewriting the rules of sea warfare. But before we explore exactly how these mosquito boats worked and why they succeeded where larger ships could not, we need to look closer at the boats themselves, their strange design, their strengths, and their glaring weaknesses. Because the truth is, the men who fought aboard them knew they were sitting on floating coffins. They looked like nothing special, just 80 feet of wood, painted dark green, with engines so loud they could be heard for miles. No armor, no steel plating, not even the heavy guns most sailors expected at sea. Yet these were the patrol torpedo boats, America's new weapon in the Pacific. To most eyes, they were fragile. A single burst of cannon fire from a Japanese destroyer could smash them to pieces. A direct hit from even a small shell would tear right through their wooden sides. But their strength was not in armor. It was in speed and surprise. Each PT boat carried 3 giant engines that could push it across the waves at more than 40 knots, faster than almost anything else in the war. On deck, the crew manned heavy machine guns and sometimes small cannons. But the real killers were the 4 long, slim torpedoes mounted on the sides. Each one could sink a ship hundreds of times the boat's own size. Imagine a rowboat carrying a weapon strong enough to break a battleship in half. That was the PT boat. Crews were small, 10 to 15 men, living and fighting together in the cramped space. They slept in shifts, ate canned food, and worked constantly to keep their machines alive in the hot, salty air of the tropics. Most were young, many still in their teens. To them, the PT boats were not just weapons. They were home, but life on board was a gamble. If caught in daylight, PT boats were easy prey for Japanese planes. If ambushed at night, they had no armor to save them. Their only defense was to strike first, strike fast, and vanish into the dark. Japanese sailors mocked them at first, calling them sewing machines or mosquito boats. But soon, those nicknames took on new meaning. Like mosquitoes, they were small, hard to kill, and carried a deadly sting. And in the Solomons, those stings were aimed directly at the Tokyo Express. The destroyers and barges of Japan carried supplies along narrow channels. They were fast, disciplined, and armed with some of the best night-fighting crews in the world. Against them, the PT boats were underdogs. But this is where the story shifts. Because despite all odds, the underdogs began to win. Night after night, these fragile craft prowled the waters, waiting in ambush. Crews held their breath as giant Japanese ships thundered past them, so close the sailors could hear voices on the enemy decks. Then, at the perfect moment, a PT skipper would whisper the order, fire. Torpedoes slid into the Black Sea. Engines roared to life. The wooden boats vanished into the dark. Moments later, the water erupted with fire. For the Japanese, it was like being hunted by shadows. For the Americans, it was proof that David really could challenge Goliath. But the fight was not just about weapons. It was about timing, patience, and nerves of steel. Because in the Solomons, the hunters and hunted often switched places in a heartbeat. Every night, the same deadly game played out across the Solomon Islands. Japanese destroyers and barges raced down what sailors called the slot, a narrow body of water stretching through the islands. To the Americans, this was the Tokyo Express, and its cargo was always the same. Food, fuel, ammunition, and soldiers desperate to retake Guadalcanal. But waiting in the dark were the midnight hunters, the PT boats. Picture the scene. The ocean is black, clouds cover the moon. Japanese destroyers speed forward in single file, their wakes glowing faintly in the water. Suddenly, radar screens on American boats flicker. Targets appear. Men tense. Hands grip torpedo triggers. The ambush begins. The PT boats accelerate, their engines growling. They cut across the Japanese path, fire their torpedoes, and turn hard away before the enemy can respond. Seconds later, water explodes. A barge vanishes. A destroyer shudders under impact. Panic spreads. Searchlights snap on, scanning wildly. Guns blaze into the night, but the hunters are already gone, swallowed again by the darkness. This was how the PT boats fought. Fast strikes, sudden chaos, then silence. The Japanese crews were some of the best night fighters in the world. They used star shells, flares, and sharp eyes to hunt enemies after dark. But PT boats were small, low in the water, and almost invisible until it was too late. Many Japanese sailors swore they were fighting ghosts. One officer wrote in his diary, "We do not see them until they strike. They come from the night itself. For the Americans, these missions were nerve-wracking. Engines overheated, torpedoes sometimes misfired, machine guns jammed in the salty air, and always, the danger of discovery hung over them. If a Japanese destroyer locked onto them, survival was unlikely. The flash of a 5-inch gun could mean instant death, yet the PT crews kept going. They learned the currents, the coastlines, the shadows cast by jungle-covered islands. They memorized enemy routes and waited at choke points. It was hunting, pure and simple, but the prey was far larger and deadlier than they were. Night after night, they bled the Tokyo Express. Barges sank. Destroyers limped away damaged. Supplies never reached hungry Japanese troops on Guadalcanal. Slowly, the midnight hunters changed the course of the campaign. But this was only the beginning. The ambushes would grow bolder, the battles bloodier, and the Japanese frustration deeper. Because the more the Tokyo Express tried to run, the more the PT boats lay in wait, and soon, the stories of these night raids would spread through both fleets. Stories of fire on the water, sudden terror, and sailors convinced they were fighting not men, but shadows. The Solomons became a stage for countless night duels, but some ambushes stood out. Moments where small wooden boats changed the fate of entire battles. One of the earliest came off Guadalcanal. A group of PT boats spotted Japanese destroyers rushing south under the cover of night. These destroyers carried food, medicine, and ammunition for the starving troops still fighting on the island. If they made it through, the Marines on shore would face another brutal counterattack. The PT crews waited in silence, their engines cut. They let the destroyers pass close. So close the American sailors could see the faint glow of cigarettes on the enemy decks. Then came the order, fire. 4 torpedoes splashed into the sea. A heartbeat later, a Japanese destroyer shuddered with a violent explosion. Flames rose high, lighting the waves. The other destroyers opened fire in panic, blasting the dark with heavy shells. But the PT boats were already gone, weaving back into the shadows. For the Marines on Guadalcanal, it meant one thing: the enemy on land would go hungry again. Another famous action came months later near New Georgia. Japanese barges were carrying troops and supplies across narrow waters. They thought themselves safe. Barges were small, low, and hard to hit, but PT boats were built for such prey. The American crews raced in close, their machine guns blazing. Wooden barges shattered under the storm of bullets. Survivors leapt into the sea, only to be hunted down by gunfire sweeping the waves. It was brutal, close, and personal. For the Japanese soldiers trapped in the water, the PT boats were not just machines. They were monsters. Survivors later described the feeling of being stalked by shadows that spat fire, leaving no escape. Perhaps the most haunting encounter came during a night when a squadron of PT boats intercepted the Tokyo Express itself, a line of powerful destroyers racing through the slot. Outnumbered and outgunned, the PT crews still pressed the attack. They launched torpedoes in desperate succession, forcing the Japanese ships to scatter and lose formation. Some torpedoes missed, some malfunctioned, but one struck home, ripping into a destroyer's hull. Even when the PTs did not sink a ship, their presence created chaos. Japanese formations broke apart, timetables collapsed, and commanders lost control. The psychological damage was as important as the physical destruction. By 1943, Japanese sailors had begun to whisper about the Phantom Fleet. To them, the PT boats were not just wooden craft. They were death itself, appearing from nowhere, striking hard, then melting back into the Black Sea. These ambushes became legends among Allied crews too. Young sailors told stories of nights when the ocean turned to fire, when men faced death and survived only by luck. Each battle proved that even the smallest craft could shape the destiny of great powers. But every ambush carried a price. For every Japanese ship lost, there was a PT boat that never came back. And for every victory told in triumph, there were stories of terror, loss, and sacrifice. To sail on a PT boat was to gamble with your life every night. The risks began before the battle even started. Engines overheated in the humid Pacific air. Saltwater corroded wires and weapons. Torpedoes jammed in their tubes. Sometimes boats went into battle half broken because there was no time to repair them. Then there was the enemy. Japanese destroyers were some of the deadliest night fighters in the world. Their gunners were quick, their torpedoes legendary. If a PT boat was spotted, it stood little chance. A single shell could tear it apart, scattering fire and splinters across the water. Survivors often had only seconds to jump into the sea. Crews lived with this fear every mission, yet they still went out. Imagine the tension. A dozen young men crouched on deck, gripping machine guns, staring into a horizon of black water. They knew somewhere out there was a Japanese convoy. They knew that once they struck, every enemy gun would turn toward them. And still, when the order came, they advanced. Many times, the gamble ended in disaster. Boats broke down mid-mission and drifted helplessly until dawn. Enemy aircraft, hunting in the morning light, spotted them and struck. Some PT boats never returned at all, but the men accepted this risk. They called themselves the Night Raiders, proud of their role. They knew that every ambush drained Japanese strength. Every lost barge starved enemy troops. Every damaged destroyer weakened Japan's hold on the Solomons. The gamble was not only physical, but mental. Long hours of waiting in the dark wore on the nerves. Every splash could be mistaken for a torpedo wake. Every shadow could hide a destroyer's gun. Men learned to live with fear, to master it, and to channel it into focus. One sailor later recalled, "The ocean was so black, you couldn't see your hand in front of your face, but you could feel the enemy out there. It was like waiting for a ghost to touch you." And yet, despite the fear, the PT boats kept returning to battle. They endured not because they were the strongest ships, but because their crews were relentless. It was courage mixed with desperation, innovation balanced by sacrifice, and it was this gamble, night after night, that wore down the Tokyo Express until even Japanese commanders began to wonder if the night itself had turned against them. For the Japanese commanders, the PT boats became a nightmare they could never solve. At first, Tokyo thought these small wooden craft were nothing more than a nuisance. They believed destroyers and cruisers would swat them away like flies. But by late 1942 and into 1943, the reports grew impossible to ignore. Convoys were delayed, barges were destroyed, troops starved on the islands because food never arrived. And every failure seemed tied to those devil boats lurking in the black waters. The frustration inside Japanese headquarters was heavy. Captains complained that even when their ships survived, they wasted fuel and lost time dodging invisible enemies. A destroyer commander wrote in his log, "We are fighting ghosts. They come from nowhere. They vanish before we can strike." The fear spread from officers to ordinary sailors. Men who once charged into battle with confidence now dreaded the night. Every dark wave could hide a PT boat. Every flash on the horizon could mean torpedoes rushing toward them. Some sailors refused to smoke on deck, afraid the glow of a cigarette would reveal them to lurking enemies. To make matters worse, Japanese technology struggled against this new type of warfare. Their radars were weak. Their searchlights often revealed more than they protected, and their barges, slow, unarmored, and overloaded, were easy prey. The PT boats did not always win, but they always struck fear. Even if they failed to sink a ship, they forced Japan to scatter its forces, burn fuel, and spend sleepless nights in worry. By 1943, the legend of the Phantom Fleet had taken hold. Stories passed from ship to ship. Some said the PT boats were guided by spirits of drowned American sailors. Others claimed they carried no humans at all, only ghosts steering wooden hulls through the dark. These tales were not true, but they reflected the raw fear Japanese sailors carried into the night. For the commanders, this fear was worse than any single battle lost. Fear breaks discipline. Fear destroys morale. And fear spreads faster than fire. The Japanese Navy was discovering that sometimes the smallest enemy can create the greatest shadow. The war moved on. New campaigns opened in New Guinea, the Marshalls, the Marianas. Aircraft carriers and battleships gained the spotlight, but the PT boats never faded from memory. For the Americans who served on them, the experience shaped their lives forever. These young men had faced death almost every night. They learned courage not in daylight glory, but in silent, lonely waters where no one could see them. One of those men was a young lieutenant named John F. Kennedy. His PT boat, PT-109, was sliced in half by a Japanese destroyer in 1943. Yet Kennedy and his surviving crew swam miles through shark-filled waters, clinging to life until they were rescued. His bravery became legend, and years later, it helped carry him into the White House. But Kennedy's story was only one among hundreds. Many PT crews died nameless, their boats burned and broken in forgotten coves. Others returned home carrying scars, some on their bodies, others deep in their minds. What they all shared was pride. They had fought the enemy with speed, daring, and relentless courage. They proved that even the smallest craft, if guided by brave hearts, could shape the outcome of war. For the Japanese, the memory of PT boats never truly faded. Veterans spoke of the terror of facing an enemy you could not see until it was too late. They remembered nights when torpedoes appeared out of nowhere, when black water suddenly erupted in fire. Even decades later, the word torpedo boat carried weight in their stories. In military history, the PT boats stand as a symbol of innovation. They showed that you do not always need the biggest guns or the heaviest armor to win. Sometimes surprise, speed, and determination are more powerful than steel. Their legacy also teaches something about fear. The PT boats did not sink hundreds of enemy ships, but they created fear that was larger than their actual damage. And that fear reshaped how Japan fought the war. The lesson is simple yet powerful. In war, perception can matter as much as reality. So when we look back at the black waters of the Solomon Islands, we see more than just wooden boats with young crews. We see shadows that haunted an empire. We see courage that defied the odds. And we see proof that even the smallest force can change the course of history. And now, I leave you with this question. If you were one of those young sailors, sitting in a fragile wooden boat in the endless dark, knowing a single enemy shell could erase you forever, would you still have the courage to face the night? See you in next video.